Hey campers, George here, back in the man cave. Woo! Shock and horror, right? I'm just doing some research again, just following up on that series that I was doing on knives. And this time I was looking into grinds and a couple of other things like angles, trying to put it all together. So I thought what I'd do is while I'm doing this, I'll share it with you. We'll talk about grinds, why certain grinds are used by the manufacturers, depending on what the knife is being used for and that sort of thing. And try and put everything back together again. And hopefully we'll have at least figured out most of the stuff that's going on with these knives. So join me. Let's do some learning. When I first started looking at knives, I wanted to learn as much as I could about knives. Everything to do with knives, whether it's a belt knife, a fixed blade knife, a folding knife, whatever type of knife it was. I wanted to learn more general knowledge on them. When I'm reading up or thinking about purchasing a knife, I wanted to make sure I was actually buying what I was looking for. And to do that, I felt I needed to know more about knives. So that became a little bit of a passion for me to try and figure it out. And that's what all these videos have been about. Me trying to figure out knives. First of all, I looked at what do you call things on a knife and why are they called that. Then we looked at blade shapes and why there are certain blade shapes. And now I'm looking at grinds. Not just grinds, but maybe a couple of other things like angle. It's all very well knowing what a grind looks like, but is the angle right? Because a grind and the angle are two different things. They will affect the performance of the knife for what you want to use it for. So they kind of go together. So I had a quick look at that as well and added some more knowledge to my overcrowded brain right now on knives. So what I thought I'd do is I'm going to go through some grinds. And the grinds I'm going to look at are probably the most common you and I would see when looking for an outdoor or an EDC type knife. You know, a lot of the information I looked at talked about kitchen knives, chef knives, that sort of thing. And surprisingly, 90% of it was a flat grind. And the reason for that is the knives are thin, they're cutting soft material like vegetables and meat, which doesn't require a robust blade. All it requires is a sharp blade. More the angle on the flat grind, the sharper the knife, the better it is for food prep. So I kind of brushed over that. That's what I figured out. And I wanted to look at what I'm going to use it for. I went and had a look at my kitchen knives, and lo and behold, all my big knives are not flat grinds. What do you do? And I wanted to look at, like I said, what you and I would typically come across when looking at an EDC knife or an outdoor knife, bushcraft, camping, whatever we're planning on using it for. If you want to be able to pick the knife you want, you need to know more about that knife. And I decided I needed to know more and kind of put it together a little bit. I've got some samples here of the knives I have, and I'll show you them with some of the grinds on them and, talk about the knife in general and why. First off, probably the most popular grind we see is a Scandi when it talks about bushcraft or an outdoor knife, even in EDC. So let's have a look at Scandi grinds. So when you talk about a Scandi grind, first off, obviously, as the name says, it was started in Scandinavia. We've all heard of the Scandi grind. Everybody uses the Scandi grind. When we talk about Scandi grinds and knives, just about everybody's heard of the Mora knife. I don't own a Mora. Sorry. But I do have a Laplander, a Buka, whatever you want to call it. And here it is here. And as you can see, very little difference between this and the Mora knife. And if you look here, this is almost a perfect example of a Scandi grind. When you look at the blade there, I'm going to tip it a little bit here so that you can see. You have this part of the blade, and then there's just one grind from there going down, straight down, and that's typically a Scandi grind. So basically a Scandi grind, as you can see, is one large grind. It's a secondary grind, what they call a secondary grind, and you can see it right there. And it just goes down to a straight point. There's the little sharp edge right on the edge of the knife here, which is the secondary grind. Scandi doesn't have that. It just has a straight down into a nice sharp edge. Very popular in bushcraft, carving. This one here you can see is basically a straight edge here, and it has the Scandi grind coming to a nice sharp point. This is stainless steel, and this was part of a combo unit that I got. I wanted the saw. They have a folding saw that came, and this came with it. Typically, for a bushcraft knife, you want that a nice sharp 90, so you can use it to strike a ferro rod, or even make really small kindling off a piece of wood just by scraping it. Very popular, very inexpensive, probably around the $14 or $15 range, and it comes with the whatever plastic this is type sheath, and it just locks in there like that. So that's a Scandi grind. It's just basically a blank. When they start with the knife, they have the blank, and they just put a secondary grind on it straight down to the cutting edge. One thing about the Scandi grind is it's really easy to sharpen. You've got one edge and that's it. And when you get your knife, you use it, it starts to get a little dull. There's nothing fancy about sharpening it. You just line up that single grind, touch it up nicely, and it makes it very easy to sharpen, hence more popular with less experienced knife people like me. I can't sharpen worth anything. I had to buy a special tool to do that. But the good thing about it is just that bottom portion of the actual knife blade, you can see it here. Just this bottom portion here is getting ground down, whereas the actual blade up here remains thick, which gives it a lot of strength. So, in bushcraft, we tend to batten and things like that. It can take a little bit more abuse, and that's what's so good about it. Let's see what's up next. The next grind I want to talk about, some people refer to as a hollow ground or a concave. And I thought, I don't think I own a knife like that. And to my shock and horror, I realized that the first real camp knife, bushcrafty style knife that I ever bought way back in, was a Browning belt knife. This guy here. And still one of my favorite knives. And the main reason being the handle, the shape of the handle. You can see how it curves down here, and it sits in my hand perfectly. But what we're talking about is the grind on the blade. Now, the difference between this and a Scandi right off the bat is there's two grinds on it. You have the main grind and then the secondary grind. And if you look here, you can see it right there. Here is the main grind, and then you have the secondary grind. The concave, or the hollow part of this grind, is right here on the main grind. You can see it there. It's actually hollowed out. So the top of the blade here has the full width of the blade, and then as you go down a little bit, you can see there, and then you get that full grind, which is hollow. And the way they do that is on a wheel or a belt that has a big diameter, and they'd hold it there, and they take off a lot of material, and it really thins the blade down, and then they go to that secondary grind on it. The advantage, you've just thinned up that blade, and they tend to be a lot sharper, but the disadvantage is it's very thin, not as strong as, say, a Scandi. So the hollow ground, you will see it a lot on like straight razors and things like that. And like I said, the advantage is incredibly thin, and you can get a really sharp edge to it on that secondary grind. The next grind I want to talk about is a flat grind, a full flat grind. And that is, the name of it explains what it is. There's no secondary grind on it, third, fourth, whatever. It literally is, if you look at it down the blade, it just goes straight down from the spine of the blade all the way down to the cutting edge. Is just one straight grind. That's all there is to it. And surprisingly, it's probably the most common grind you've dealt with on an everyday basis. And like I said before, that would be your kitchen knives. And one of the reasons is you get that full flat ground, they take a lot of material off the blade. It starts off thick to give it some strength and then tapers down to point right on the cutting edge. The closest I have to that right with me right now is this guy from Oppenau. Now, when I feel it here, it almost feels rounded. Okay, but this, if you look at it, hopefully you can see that. You see how, if I turn it slightly now, there's no other grind except that one grind all the way from the top, all the way to the bottom. If you look carefully, you can actually see it does have a little bulge in the middle here, and that's something else we're going to talk about. But this really shows, although not a true full flat grind, it is just one grind all the way through. The advantages obviously is slicing. And when you take that much material off, you're going to get a really thin blade. And that's why it's so popular in food prep. It has that thin, very thin blade with the grind going all the way down. And it comes to a really nice sharp edge, perfect for slicing. Doesn't have a lot of strength, but it's extremely sharp. The disadvantage is it's not very thick and it's not very sturdy. Plus, trying to put an edge back on there takes some skill. One of the reasons is we're all used to that secondary grind at the bottom, right where the blade edge is. And to get that full grind, you're going to land up putting a secondary grind on it if you don't get the right angle. Full flat, very common, everyday use in the kitchen on a knife that we use, an EDC. This is, like I said, is the Oppenau number 12, and it's their special one. I forget what they call it. I think it's the Adventurer or something like that. And it has a ferro rod in it. It has a couple of extras on it. It's kind of a survivalist style knife. And this one does have a really good 90 degree on the spine. And if you have it, it looks like a clip point here. Maybe more of a Sabre style knife. So, and it has that full grind. So it's great for slicing, hunting, that sort of thing. Would I batten this? Probably it's thick enough. I wouldn't do anything heavy with it, but I could probably split some stuff with it. The disadvantage is splitting. With splitting, obviously you want a wider blade with a greater angle on the cutting edge because it tends to push the wood apart when you batten. A full grind knife. One grind, top to bottom. Now, they don't always go from the very top to the bottom. It might start a little bit further down, maybe down here somewhere. So you do have some thickness there, which gives that full grind a little bit more strength. But it is simply one grind all the way to the bottom. The next grind we want to talk about, and I kind of mentioned it before, and that is the Convex blade. And that is a full grind, but it's not flat. And same knife again, we're back to that same Oppenau that I have. And this is a Convex grind. Basically, you don't have that sharp edge coming down. It actually bulges and comes down into it. The advantage of that is it gives a lot of strength here in the middle of the blade. And, you know, you've got your full grind here. It goes down a little bit, but it curves in all the way down to the cutting edge. Very popular with a saber or a slashing weapon. So it's really a good tactical grind. Back in the day, the cavalry, they did this grind. And the reason was it had enough strength in the middle to support the blade and then came down to that really sharp edge at the bottom, which really made it perfect for a saber and slashing. This is kind of a saber point, although I used it as an example as a flat grind. The difference between this and a flat grind is this has a bulge in the middle like I told you about, whereas a flat grind is just a dead straight all the way down to the cutting edge. The advantage to this is you still have a very good cutting edge, but you have a lot of support behind that cutting edge, which gave it a lot of strength, especially when you're striking down with it. Bushcraft, a lot of people like a convex blade. The problem with it is that to get a convex blade, you actually have to do it by hand. Doing it on a grinding wheel or something like that, ooh, and it's very labor intensive. So typically a good bushcraft knife with a convex blade coming down to this nice shaft point is going to be more expensive, simply because it takes more to get that grind. For a saber, tactical knife, that sort of thing, for bushcraft and carving and that, because the blade is thin enough where you can get a nice sharp edge on it, you can do some delicate work with it, and it still has that strength along the middle, right behind the cutting edge. It's that convex shape. Now, talking about a full flat grind and a convex grind, a lot of people will refer to it as a saber grind. It's actually a combination, and you can see that here. The advantage of it is some will do a full flat, and some, when they do that, they leave a little bit more on the top along the spine of the blade to give it that strength, and then come down to a flat grind. And that was a way to get around the convex shape, which was a better blade for slicing in a saber, but was difficult to sharpen and keep that convex point to it. You would have different combinations. This is a saber, and it would have a convex grind to it. This is a saber, and it has a hollow grind to it, where it comes right in like that. It's nice and thin, perfect for slicing, but it wasn't a long, deep hollow. It was fairly shallow because they needed that strength on the spine. Otherwise, the sabers would just break. Now we get one of those grinds where it's that cool-looking knife. And you know what I'm talking about. And that's the American Tanto knife. So let's have a look at that. Pretty interesting. So here is my American Tanto from GCS Knives. Now, the interesting part about this, when you start talking about grinds, is you have two blades on this knife, and you can see it right away. You've got that front edge, and you've got the bottom edge. The bottom here, if I'll show you now, you can see, hopefully I can show you that, down here, and in fact up there, you can see right there, it's concave. So you have a concave grind right here on this bottom blade, which comes down to a nice sharp point, which is great for slicing. So you have that, and then on the front flat portion of the grind here is basically, ideally it would be a concave, so it has a lot of strength there, or it could be a flat grind. This one I believe is concave, and if you look carefully you can see it there, and you can see the hollow here. So you got the two different grinds. The advantage is it makes it come up here to a very strong, well-reinforced point. So now you have a great slicer that has a sharp and strong stabbing point to it. That is why this style is so popular as a tactical knife, and that is because of the strong point and that slicing edge down at the bottom here, which makes it a great tactical knife. Disadvantage is that concave here, the point, when you want to do delicate work with the point, it's very thick. And if you look there, you can see how it comes, it broadens out very quickly there. Extremely strong though, and has a lot of support behind it. And that's why the American Tanto is so popular with tactical. Makes a great saber as well. And if you remember my description of a Japanese style Tanto, it doesn't have this bottom edge here. If looking there, it actually looks more like this edge up here, where it has that full long curve up there and concave grind to it, which was perfect for slicing. So the adapted version, the American version, has two cutting edges, and that was why. That strong point here that you got out of grinding at a certain weight here and then doing a hollow grind down here. Pretty interesting. I always wondered about that, and now I know. What can I say? Sometimes I actually learn things. So there was a very quick and dirty look at probably the most popular grinds. Now remember, some of the grinds are a little bit different. They'll have an extra secondary edge on it or something like that, depending on what the manufacturer is looking for. Each grind is specific for its use. It's obviously better at one thing than another, and that's why you have those different grinds. And the manufacturers sometimes combine them to get a more general use knife. Is that a good idea? I'm not sure. It'll give you a good solid all-round knife, maybe a camp knife versus a bushcraft or a hunting knife. Hunting, you want to be able to slice. You've got to get the skin your game. What I want to talk to you about now, and I talked about this in the beginning, is the angles. Now, I was like, well, angles. How many angles are there? Well, there's actually a wide range depending on use. There we go. So now we're looking at knives where we looked at the type of knife, the blade shape, the grind that was used on that knife, and now we're looking at the angle of the grind. So there are a couple of different things that make up a knife. A little bit more complicated than I thought it was, but let's have a quick and dirty look at angles. If you look up here right now, here is a picture of angles. Okay, and these are probably the most common angles used on your everyday knives, typical knives. Unless it's a very special knife, typically those are the common angles. Probably the most common angle, 20 degrees. Now, when you and I think 20 degrees, that's pretty small. But if you look at the picture here, the actual 20 degrees is on one side of the cutting edge, and then you have 20 on the other side. So your total angle on your cutting edge is actually 40 if you're using a 20 degree. Hopefully that made some sense to you. So when they talk about a 17 degree angle, well, that's 34 degrees total. That 17 is the one side. And you go, well, why do they do that? The reason is a lot of non-European knife manufacturers make chisel blades. In other words, only one edge, one side of the blade is angled for the cutting edge. So you have a flat angle like this. Well, that's 17 degrees total, 20 degrees total. This is just straight flat. Still got a cutting edge to it, but that's pretty typical of the way they did it. Why? Have no idea. But in some countries, that's what they do. Now we've got these angles. The most common angle you come across on knife blades is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about hatchets or anything else like that or specialty stuff. But your typical knives out there is around about the 20 degree range. And it ranges from about 17 to about 25 degrees, depending on the use of the knife. So I'm going to quickly go through that with you, the different degrees and what I found out about them. So now you've decided you want to buy a knife, and it would be something like a hunting knife, pocket knife, or a survival bushcrafty type knife. Here, the typical angles you're going to find anything from 25 to 30 degrees, which surprised me. But when I thought about it, you need a bit of strength in it. So you don't want it too thin. You're going to be doing some heavy work on it, and you want to keep that edge. Too thin an angle, you're going to have an edge that you can damage a lot quickly, and you're going to have to keep sharpening it. You don't really want to do that when you're out there doing your work. In the 22 to 25 degree range, here's where you're going to find knives like kitchen knives, chef's knives, that sort of thing. Use that sort of an angle. You even find them on boning knives or smaller knives. So the angle is a little bit tighter than you would have your hunting knives and that, where they were from 25 to 30. When you start talking about real high quality kitchen knives or chef's knives like sushi knife, a paring or a fillet knife, you're starting to get down to some really tight angles, 17 to 22 degrees, which is a lot more than the other ones, and it's a lot thinner. But the work you're doing is delicate. You're not doing any heavy work with it. So the thickness of the blade isn't that much of a concern. You're looking at sharpness and being able to do some really thin slicing with it. So the angle is a lot less. When you start getting into the 12 to 17 degree angle, you start to talk about straight razors or razor blades that need to be extremely sharp. Obviously, extremely thin. So there's no strength in those at all. But if you look at what they're used for, there's no real strength needed for them. So the angle is a lot less again. Then you go down even more. Now, I'm not sure if you know what an X-Acto knife is, but it's typically a hobby-style knife. And you get the handle and you have different shapes, and you can do some delicate work with them. Or down to the 7 to 12 degree range, which is nothing. It makes the blade extremely thin. It has no strength. It's all about that tight edge and how sharp you can make the blade. Those guys, slicing paper and things like that, no problem. Straight through and a beautiful cut to it. On an everyday use type thing, those blades are no good to us. They're just not strong enough. So there's some quick and dirty information on angles. So depending on the knife you want is the angle you're looking for. Still not sure? Just remember 20 degrees. 20 degrees is a good starting point for any knife that we're going to use typically in the bush or every day, even in your kitchen. But for bushcraft, camp knife, hunting, that sort of thing, 20 degrees is a great starting point. So keep that in mind when you're looking for a knife. There is something else when you consider knives. We've looked at handles, knife shapes, the blade shapes, grinds, angles. Well, there's one more thing that we need to look at as well. Well, do we really need to? And that is the steel used in that blade. That can get really complicated. They've made it easy by using the Rockwell system to grade the steel quality in strength and that sort of thing as far as the steel types. Obviously, the higher the number, the harder the steel. The problem with that is when steel gets really hard like that, when they heat it to make, to develop the grinds and the shape of the blade and things like that, if they really heat it a lot and you get a high Rockwell number, what's going to happen is that steel gets really brittle. And if it gets too brittle, one good tap and it'll snap. So keep that in mind. Depending, once again, you're looking at what am I using this knife for? You have to keep that in mind first. So knowing all this information is great, but I can tell you right now, and from personal experience, you need to know what you're going to use that knife for. It's great to have this great looking knife that has a high Rockwell hardness. It has this beautiful blade shape. It's a Tanto. It's got 2 grinds on it. One grind's better than the other. Can use it for 2 different things. That sort of stuff. And this is going to be my bushcraft knife. Well, maybe not. Number one thing, what are you going to use it for? If you know that, then you can look at these other things, and that'll help you get a better knife, better suited for a specific job. And that job is what you're going to use the knife for. Your bushcraft knife is going to be different to my bushcraft knife, simply because what we consider to be bushcraft and what we use it for, we're all different. It's just nice to know all this information. So when you're looking for a knife, well, the grind's here. Well, I know that grind is kind of not that great for bushcraft. You've just got rid of that knife, and now you're looking a little deeper and getting a little closer to almost, you'll never get there, but almost the perfect knife that you're looking for a specific job. That's the plan anyway. Don't forget, like, share, subscribe. You know the story, and hopefully you've learned something here. I've learned a lot. Now I have a better understanding. I don't know everything by a long shot, but I have a better grounding in my knives. They sharp and shiny, can't walk past them. I'm thinking about axes and hatchets right now. Just saying. Thanks for watching. And you all be safe out there, especially with these sharp and shiny things. And you're getting a real tight angle. It's going to be sharp. Thanks for watching.